So, welcome to the skull. So, you might remember from the beginning of the class, we talked about planes. And the coronal plane is the plane that is going to separate a person into an anterior or front half and a posterior or back half. So, for that reason, this suture is called the coronal suture because it runs in the coronal plane. Okay, the coronal suture. Similarly, you might recall that we have a sagittal plane, and the sagittal plane separates a person into right and left portions. So for that reason, this is the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture. Okay. On the side, we have the squamosal suture, which is going to go from here to here. Squamosal suture. Remember when we were doing cells, squamous cells were squish-squash cells, or they looked like a scale. So this looks kind of like a flattened feature here. So it's kind of flat on the side. So I like to think of it as the squamosal suture because it's flattened or squished and squashed like the cells were. Okay. The last suture you need to know is on the back, and this suture runs from here up here. This is that sagittal suture, and then it runs back down. Okay. So this is the lambdoidal suture, and it's called lambdoidal because it looks like the Greek letter lambda, which looks like an upside down Y or a triangle for capital. So the lambdoidal suture. The cranial bones include the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone. You might remember the forehead was the frontal region. Underneath here, we have the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, so this is the frontal bone. The frontal bone goes all the way to the coronal suture, which is here. Behind the frontal bone, we have the parietal bones. One here and one here, the parietal bones. The two parietal bones are separated by the sagittal suture. Going to the side, here we see the frontal bone, the parietal bone, very large. And then this is that squamosal suture. This is the coronal suture. And this bone that goes all the way here is the temporal bone. The temporal bone. Okay, under here we have the temporal lobe, which processes sound information. This is also where you have your ear. That's where you would put your Q-tip in. Okay. So think tempo, timpani, think music or sound when you hear the temporal bone. We also have a small portion of the sphenoid that we can see here. So this is kind of your headache spot when you rub your temples right here. That's the sphenoid. And it's only visible from the outside, just right here. And on the other side, right here. So that's the sphenoid. The sphenoid is actually only one bone, and it spans the floor of the cranium. And we'll look at that in some more detail in a little bit. On the back, recall this is the sagittal suture, the lambdoidal suture, and this is the occipital bone. The occipital bone is in the back. You might remember the back of the head is the occipital region. And under here, we have the occipital lobe, okay, which processes visual information. Now, you don't really get the full glory of the occipital bone just from looking at it from the back because it actually continues, and all of this is also occipital bone, including the hole here and these features here, which we'll talk about also. We also have the ethmoid bone, which you can see part of it up the nose, and part of it when I open up the skull cap. Let's go ahead and start looking at the cranial bones and the structures that you're responsible for each of these. For the frontal bone, there are no structures you need to know for that. There are no structural structures that you need to know for the parietal bones. Let's do the occipital bone. The occipital bone is back here. There's that lambdoidal suture. And there are two structures associated with this that you need to know. And they're both located on the inferior or bottom portion of the skull. The first is this big hole. And in fact, that's its name, big hole. It's Foramen Magnum. Foramen, recall, means hole. Okay, so Foramen Magnum. Now, you might remember that the spinal cord and the brainstem are a continuous structure. There's no physical separation between the two. So it begs the question, when do we stop calling it brainstem and start calling it spinal cord? And the answer is when the brainstem exits the skull through the foramen magnum, at that point we start calling it spinal cord. The other structures that you need to know are here and here. These are the occipital condyles. The occipital condyles. Now, condyle means knuckle or knuckle-like. So these actually pretty much kind of look like a knuckle. They're true to their name. The function of the occipital condyles is to articulate with the uppermost vertebrae, which is the C1 vertebrae. The C1 vertebrae is called the atlas. It's called the Atlas after the Greek god Atlas that carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. So your C1 vertebrae carries the weight of the world, your brain, your skull, on its shoulders. Let's do the temporal bone next. So the temporal bone on the outside is going to include this structure here, as well as all of this. Okay. The first thing I want to point out is the external auditory meatus, or external auditory canal. Meatus means canal. This is where you would put your Q-tip in. This is the external auditory meatus. The jawbone is the mandible. This is the mandible. Do you see this little indentation here on the temporal bone? Not the glue itself, but just this indentation. That is the mandibular fossa. Fossa means shallow bowl. And it's called the mandibular fossa because it is going to articulate with the mandibular condyle, also known as the condyloid process, but mandibular condyle. Okay, and that's going to articulate right here with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So I also have this structure here that juts forth, and this is part of the temporal bone. This portion is actually called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, the reason it has its name is this is the zygomatic bone. So it's called for what it's pointing to. So this is the zygomatic bone. And to make things more confusing, the zygomatic bone, this little portion here, is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So that means we have the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Zygomatic process of the temporal bone. External auditory meatus of the temporal bone. And mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Now, the last one that you need to know for the temporal bone, I actually have to take off the skull cap. So when you look at the inside of the skull, you'll notice this butterfly-like structure. The bottom of these wings, these are actually called petrous ridges. The bottom part of these wings that you see here, the first hole that you see, here's one, a little tiny hole here. The first hole you see underneath there is the internal auditory meatus. There's one here. And beneath the other wing, one there. Okay. So this is the internal auditory meatus. This is where the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to go through the skull to get to the brain. Okay, so internal auditory meatus. Let's talk about the sphenoid. So on the outside, we just see this portion as the sphenoid. Okay, and also on the other side. But the sphenoid makes up a large portion of this winged structure here. This, let me outline it here. And that's why I got these skulls in particular, because you can actually see the sutures. They're colored in. So it makes it a little bit easier for you to see what I'm pointing at. Okay, so this structure here that is outlined, this butterfly-like structure. Actually, I don't like to refer to it as a butterfly. I like to say that it's a sphinx, because that will remind you that it's the sphenoid. So the sphenoid looks like a sphinx. And there's a couple of features of the sphinx that I want you to know. Pretend this is the mouth of the sphinx, this chamber here, and these are the eyes of the sphinx. They have a reason. This chamber here, this is the sella turcica of the sphenoid. This little chamber, the sella turcica of the sphenoid. Now, the sella turcica is a tiny chamber that is going to house the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland actually lies at the base of the brain, and it's responsible for secreting human growth hormone. The sella turcica, the way I like to remember the sella turcica is that wine comes from the cellar and wine goes in the mouth. Okay, so wine comes from the cellar and wine goes in the mouth. Sella turcica, wine goes in the mouth, wine comes from the cellar. These are the optic foramina, sometimes called the optic canals. Foramina is plural for holes. Foramen would be one. Okay, and this is where the optic nerve goes through. So if I stick my stick in here and see where it comes out, isn't that cool? That's where it comes out. So this is where the optic nerve is going to go through the skull and enter the brain. Through the optic foramen of the sphenoid. So one would be foramen, both would be foramina. And we also have an area up here that shows part of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone. Some of the ethmoid bone is seen up the nose. So if we look up the nose of our skull, one of the things that you might notice is I have this line here, this big vertical line. The top, from about here up, the superior or top 2/3 or so of the nasal septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay. On the sides, these are actually the middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. I don't want to confuse you, but the bottom concha, the inferior nasal concha, is not part of the ethmoid bone. It's actually considered a separate bone. Okay, so if I ask you for the nasal concha, I'm going to ask you for these two, and they're part of the ethmoid bone. These are the middle nasal concha. You also have superior nasal concha, which are deep into the skull and can't be visualized from this view. The perpendicular plate that makes up the top 2/3 or so of the nasal septum, and the function of the nasal concha, concha means shell. The nasal concha are actually shell-like structures, sometimes referred to as turbinates, and they swirl the air to moisten it and warm the air before it gets down into deeper respiratory structures. The two you need to know from this view is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the nasal concha of the ethmoid. The other two structures of the ethmoid bone are visible here. If you put your finger right here, you're going to feel something sticking up. Okay, a little crest that's sticking up here. Just that part that sticks up is the crista galli the crista galli of the ethmoid. Okay. Now, crista galli means rooster's comb. So this sticks up like a rooster's comb, the crista galli. If you look real close, on either side of the crista galli, we have tiny little holes. Those holes are the cribriform plates. Cribriform plates. Now, each of those holes is a passageway for olfactory nerves that carry the sense of smell to enter into the brain. Okay. So I like to think of that as it's a cribriform plate, so I think of stinky baby. Okay, when the baby's stinky, you need to reform the crib. On either side, we've got the cribriform plates. The cribriform plates. Okay. And then the crista galli is here in the middle. Your cheek, the cute poofy part of your cheek when you smile, that is your zygoma or zygomatic bone. That is the bone of the cheek, and it goes from here to here to here. So this whole structure here. For the zygoma or zygomatic bone, there's one structure you need to know, which is this little portion here. This is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And you might recall, this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So those two are really weird. Together, those two structures make up what we call the zygomatic arch. That whole bar is made up of two different bones, though. So, zygomatic process of the temporal bone and temporal process of the zygomatic bone. All right. The main face bone is called the maxilla, sometimes called the maxillary bone. So the maxilla is going to go from this upper lip portion up to the cheekbone, which is a zygoma, and then up to the nasal bones. So the main bone of the face is the maxilla, or maxillary bone. We have two tiny bones at the bridge of the nose. One here, and one there. And these are the nasal bones. When you break these bones, you can see why you might get black eyes, because look at the association. They're right there. Okay. So those are the nasal bones. Now, one of your SAT words may have been lachrymose. The word lachrymose means sad. Right now, you might be sad, welling up with tears because you're like, oh my God, this is so much information. Right? So only appropriate that we add this in. So this is the lacrimal bone, and it has the lacrimal duct, which is the tear duct, and there's a little tiny indentation here. Sometimes it's more of a hole. Sometimes it's just, this one's just got a tiny indentation. That's where the tear ducts are. That's your tear duct. So it's called the lacrimal bone. Now we talked about the upper 2/3 of the nasal septum, but what about the bottom portion? This bottom portion here of the nasal septum is a separate bone called the vomer, V-O-M-E-R, the vomer. Now, there's two views of the vomer I could ask you for. I could ask you for the vomer here, or here. Just this little line in the middle. The vomer is just a very thin bone, like a thin plate. Okay, so that's the vomer. While we're down here, let's look at the palatine bone. The palatine bone is going to make up the posterior 1/4 or so of the hard palate. Okay, and I've got two little bones here. Both of these are palatine bones. These are paired bones, so palatine bones. If you're wondering what bone this is, that's actually part of the maxilla. Okay, and palatine bones here. There's the vomer. The mandible is the jawbone. There's one structure that you need to know for this class. And this is the mandibular condyle or condyloid process. And this is going to articulate with the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. Questions, comments, or panic attacks?